The swing from Romanticism to realism takes a quantum leap with Gustave Flaubert, the French writer, primarily a novelist, incorporates all of the instincts and fitful experiments that have been going on, bubbling up throughout the later Romantic era, and he takes it and he brings literature in a distinct new direction, and really sets a template for realism and for novelists in general as a somewhat middle class form of looking at the world and portraying it. The Flaubert was born in 1821. He lived until 1880. Decent life. Was born in Rouen, over on towards the west of France. He lived most of his life in the provinces, in that same general area. Generally, did not particularly like Paris. He went to school there for a little while, dropped out. He was not a big fan of Paris, and so he reacted against it largely in his works, where mostly he stays confined to the provincial world, and kind of sets up Paris as this this metropolitan other that to which he sort of reacts against. His career begins with what is to this day his most famous novel, Madame Bovary, which is a remarkable achievement for a first-time writer. It was just astounding. Came out in 1856, was immediately denounced for immorality, for taking a very clear-eyed look, let's say, at the problems of the problems of the middle class in society, problems of the provinces, notions of class, notions of gender discrimination to a large degree, and frankly, sexuality. The argument over that was quite vociferous. It was followed throughout by a distinguished career of what many people consider multiple masterpieces, notably the novel Salammbô, and which came out in 1862, and then Sentimental Education in 1869. Published other stuff throughout that time. Not a particularly prolific writer. He was when you compare him to the other contemporaries, let's say, of the big French novelists of his day, in the earlier part of it, there's Balzac, who could grind out a 300-page novel in a weekend and then wake up Monday morning, suck down a barrel of coffee, and sit down and start on the next one without missing a beat. He was a profuse writer, and he was sending off his pages to the printer the minute he lifted his pen from the page. At the end of it, Zola, also very prolific, and less so than Balzac, but more or less trying to he was more or less trying to complete the job that Balzac started by casting this vast canvas of multiple works to portray the entirety of society at the time. Flaubert is different. Flaubert was not so profuse. Flaubert is a vigorous stylist in prose, and noted most famously as a striver for les mots justes, the right word, just the right word for every single word. And so he would write a page, and it would take him a good length of time, and then he would stare at that page for an interminable length of time, and sitting there crossing out, changing words, replacing words, switching things around, flipping sentences back and forth all over the place, always striving to have just the right cut to what he's trying to do. And that takes time. And so it cuts into your natural productivity. But in so doing, he inaugurates a kind of determination in writing, in novel writing, that really hadn't been there in the same way before. The novel was largely what I think Dickens, another contemporary, called a loose, baggy monster. Maybe that wasn't him, actually. But these profuse stories that just go on and on and on, and are generally, in Dickens' case, of course, he got paid by the word, so he would just flood the zone with language and just keep writing and writing and writing. And so the words can be a little, it's a word, a little sloppy from time to time. You wish sometimes that many of the writers would take more time to craft their prose. A novel should not take as much time to write as it does to read, and for many of the writers of this era, it seems like it was more or less equivalent. They were just grinding it out. Flaubert does away with all of that, and he really sweats blood with every single mark he puts on the page. And it shows. You can bring a level of attention to detail in Flaubert that most of his contemporaries just do not stand up to. You can really talk about, well, what is his intention here? Because he has this word just like this. Now, of course, in translation, this can be a little dicey, but the firm, lean character of his prose allows great discipline and exactitude in its analysis, as much as it did, presumably, in its writing. In 1877, he comes out with Un Cœur Simple, A Simple Heart. It's one of 3 stories in a volume that he puts out, and it is a remarkable testament to everything that he was trying to do, which is kind of a great realist tradition of cataloging the society that he sees around him, of noting it almost like a naturalist, like another contemporary, Charles Darwin, would do for birds in the South Pacific or sea turtles or whatever it is. Flaubert, goes and he studies and records the lives and habitats of provincial France in the mid-1800s. And this effort is aided by his style, which is very much objectifying, swinging away from the romantic tendency to let's say heroize certain characters over others, to judge or condemn certain characters over others, and to arrange the story in such a way that, let's say, good always triumphs, evil is punished, and the outcome of every conflict is somehow validating of something. He doesn't do that. Flaubert is really very objective, very distant. He famously says that the writer in a work of fiction should be like God. He should be He should be sensed everywhere and seen nowhere. There, you can try and pin down like, oh well, there, that's the narrator talking, in Flaubert's voice, but chances are you'd be wrong, and you're really stretching the evidence to reach that conclusion. He is very, very reserved in what he tells the reader to think about somebody or something in his stories. And that allows the reader an awful lot of freedom. It grants that the reader has that freedom to begin with. This is in the mid 1800s, a period of increasing middle class leisure time, increasing middle class educational opportunities. They have more money. They're getting more concerned with points of culture that before had only been accessible to the wealthier classes. And so he is writing to them very specifically. And the perspective he takes is at times from within their ranks and at times very much outside their ranks. He gives you a bird's eye view more often than not of society, and it is very frequently unflattering. But it is still an eye view of something in the provinces, in the middle class, the bourgeoisie, and beneath the working class, the lower classes. He is shining a light on areas of society that did not get an awful lot of representation, certainly not a lot of representation that was particularly honest, that didn't just see, sturdy peasants or, depraved lower class members. He would show you warts and all what a given segment of society was like, but he is still showing it to you. He's not just sort of glancing by or refusing to see it so that he can focus on the beautiful people. So you can slice that a number of different ways. He gives a kind of voice to a segment of society that was largely underrepresented. The story itself of A Simple Heart is fairly simple. It is the story of a woman who suffers a seemingly endless series of losses throughout her life, and the story just charts it throughout her entire life. It's a fairly long life, and registers her reactions to each of these losses, and in the process gives us a demonstration of how the working class deals with loss. And this portrait shows you a kind of honesty about it. Now, you can look at it in a number of different ways. She does, Felicity is her name, means happiness. Symbolism. Felicity is, admirable, I would guess, in the way she endures her suffering, the way she keeps going, the way she finds a kind of dignity in the station that she has, even as everybody else around her is forcing her to, suffer some of the worst indignities. She doesn't get a lot of opportunities to feel good about herself. But she marshals on. There is something quite admirable and, yes, even heroic about that. But at the same time, we are shown all of her flaws, all of her limitations, and they very frequently do jibe with, the stereotypes of the time. She is very ignorant. She really cannot read at all. She has very little capacity for abstract thought, although significantly she does from time to time have breakthroughs in that. She is a simple, humble person in everything that that means, a simple heart. And you can look at it as kind of pathetic if you want, or you can look at it as heroic if you want. But the simple truth is Flaubert is looking at it or showing it to you as both. You get in this, you see, from the very beginning, she loses. She loses her parents. She loses everything in everything a child can lose. She loses her parents. Her sisters famously go their separate ways, which gives them a kind of agency, like they abandoned her, abandoned Felicity. Her father dies, her mom dies, and then they say her sisters went their separate ways. So that's not, them being taken away from her passive voice. That is them just sort of drifting off, which suggests, well, okay, maybe the poor people don't have the kind of sentimental attachments that we proper bourgeoisie have. They are crude, they are cruel. That's quite heartless. Felicity then finds herself essentially taken in by a neighborhood farmer who also treats her quite cruelly. He starves her, he beats her, he just completely neglects her. She has to drink from puddles. It's just the most inhuman. And that's the point. She is in that milieu. It is ugly. It is hard. It is at times quite inhuman. But she endures. She struggles through and she moves on to the next thing. She always survives and goes on. This is significant, and this is in the face of a society that is seemingly quite stacked against her, the reality of which is pointed out in the very first few paragraphs or sentences, even. The background of her childhood comes in significantly in the second chapter, short chapters. It's a relatively very brief novella or a longer short story. But the opening is of her in her current state at this writing as an adult working in the service of a relatively well-off bourgeoisie woman, somebody who's had a tragedy of her own, and we start with her story. And so Felicity only kind of sneaks in as an afterthought because, well, she's just the help. She doesn't get her own story. We start off with the story of the employer, Madame Aubin, and we're told that the women of Pont-l'Evêque, I'm going to butcher pronunciations, French, envied Madame Aubin, her maidservant, Felicity. So think of that word, envy. It's a kind of yearning. It's a kind of jealousy. It's essentially a very negative and nasty emotion, but it is also somewhat aspirational. It's marveling at something more, something better than what you have. Interesting. Very first line, beginnings and endings. You can see Flaubert really sweating that sentence. In return for 100 francs a year, she did all the cooking and the housework, the sewing, the washing, and the ironing. She could bridle a horse, fatten poultry, and churn butter, and she remained faithful to her mistress, who was by no means an easy person to get on with. So Felicity's entire worth, that she is so esteemed by the neighbors, her entire worth is about what she can do for her mistress, Madame Aubin. Her value is strictly about labor. We're told about Aubin's history. Her husband died, leaving her a pile of debts, and she has to sell off a lot of her stuff and take a smaller home, but she still has some resources, so she is still fairly comfortable. She's not starving, and she can still employ Felicity, although you get a sense it's perhaps at a somewhat cut rate. Describing the house that Felicity is now going to be working at, we're told the house had a slate roof and stood between an alleyway and a lane leading down to the river. Inside there were differences in level which are the cause of many a stumble. Differences in level which are the cause of many a stumble. That is right there, first page. Differences in level, differences in class that are the cause of many a stumble. And again, Felicity gets into trouble because she misunderstands class. She doesn't understand when she is transgressing those invisible barriers between stations in life, and how, as a humble maid, she should not impose upon those above her. The little realities like that crop up throughout the story. They're always there. This sense of class. We're given long lists of or long descriptions of the house, and it is filled with lots of little middle-class bourgeoisie decorations and decor, all chosen, it would seem, to signify a certain station in life, a certain comfort level, a certain materialist inclination, materialism of the middle class, materialism of a rising middle class who wants to show with all of their material possessions that they are in the middle class, that they are better than the working class, even, or perhaps even more so, than the people who are really wealthy. Because Madame Aubin, we're told, has suffered some financial losses recently. She has had to, move into a smaller place. She has had to, in the wake of her husband's death, she has had to simplify her lifestyle just a little bit. And you get the sense that she is very conscious of slipping any further down that social hierarchy, that economic chain. She doesn't want to give any impression that she is, anything less than she was before. And all of those little trinkets, all of those little decorations, all of the furniture are a signal to everybody around her. And the friends she maintains, the local gentry, if you will, in this small provincial village, are very conscious of their place in society and their higher rank than Felicity or any of the other commoners beneath them. This is a provincial life. As opposed to in Paris, you get the sense of it is going to be much more dynamic, especially underneath the ranks of the aristocracy. of which you can, the French politics throughout the 1800s were kind of all over the place. But in terms of, historically, in terms of social mobility, cities tend to be a little bit more flexible, and people are rising and falling with greater regularity there. And it is much more, let's say, opportunistic. In the provinces, it's a much more steady stratification. And you get the sense of all of these people who are perhaps trying to shore up their own value in opposition to, we're from the real France out in the provinces, God's country. That is somewhat in opposition to all those people in France who think that, or all those people in Paris who think they're so fancy, and maybe they look down on us. Well, we are going to match that by looking down on everybody. We'll look down on them. We will be much more vigilant about looking down upon everybody around us in the provinces. It's a fairly conventional habit of suburban and non-urban life. The first real issues with class become probably most explicit when she's dealing with the children of Madame Aubain. Madame Aubain has been left with a young son and daughter, and Felicity is now in charge of them, essentially. But the relationship has to change over time. There is, years go by. Sometimes you're reading along, you hit a new paragraph, and several years went by. Like, whoa, okay. But after she suffers the loss of her parents, after her sisters abandon her, after she suffers the loss of her first love, who moves on to somebody better, she finds herself working for Madame Aubain and these two children, and she loves the children, and she is a very engaged caretaker for them, and you can really see, like, okay, this is not just a job for her. She really dotes on them, particularly the little girl, Virginia, and Madame Aubain has some reservations about this. She doesn't necessarily like the challenge to status. And as the children grow up, she has to remind her that, at certain points that, okay, you can no longer be so familiar with them, especially as they start to reach their adolescence. You are to be much more deferential to them. You're there to serve them, not to, be an authority over them. And that's, levels of familiarity. Can you call someone by their first name? Well, no, maybe you should be calling them Mademoiselle at this point. That is, those little notes get struck with not a lot of attention drawn to them. But those little notes get struck throughout. It is a very distinct and persistent thread throughout the entire piece that she needs to know her place. And it's awkward for her. And she is constantly having to remind herself, I'm just a servant here. I don't necessarily have that kind of freedom or that kind of privilege within the family. I'm not a member of the family. I'm not a member of the class. So I'm an outsider. I am less than. This does not mean that she doesn't have great capacity as a human being. She is, at one point, there is the episode with the bull where they find themselves being essentially chased by a bull in a field, Madame Aubaine, the children, and Felicity. And Felicity essentially saves the children and Madame Aubaine. She challenges the bull. She starts throwing dirt in its eyes and backing away from it and essentially drawing the bull to herself so that Madame Aubaine and the children can escape and get outside this little enclosure or whatever. And that's remarkable heroism, and it's a very quick little incident that passes like nothing. And after it's over, she just we're told that she didn't really consider it anything particularly significant. It's like, no, I'm certainly not a hero, but she is in that moment. She is much more than a servant. A maidservant's role does not entail getting yourself stomped or gored by a bull in service of the children. But she does out of love. So she is capable of that. Another very significant and somewhat more detailed episode is when Virginia starts going to religious instructions. She has to learn her catechism because she's growing up, in a fairly traditional conservative Catholic environment, and she has to go, or Felicity has to go with her and just bring her to the lessons, bring her to the religious observances in the church. And with her somewhat scattershot upbringing, Felicity has never really experienced this before. She's never thought about things before. There's no evidence really that she can read any of it or understand any of it. And we're told that the theology of everything was quite beyond her. And yet, she herself is transported by the experience of watching Virginia go through this religious practice. It's very significant. Now, for one thing, the description that we're given of it is really very matter of fact. We're not given, the reader is not transported along on some grand spiritual plane through sweeping rhetoric about the glory of God or anything like that. It is very, very prosaic description. The choir stalls were all occupied, with the boys on the right and the girls on the left, while the curé stood by the lectern. In one of the stained glass windows of the apse, the Holy Ghost looked down on the Virgin. Another window showed her kneeling before the infant Jesus, and behind the tabernacle there was a wood carving of St. Michael laying the dragon. Again, you get a sense of, okay, he's laying out the landscape, laying out in like he's taking notes on, okay, this is what is in this environment. And it's all very materialistic. He's identifying these items, but they are all just items sitting there. Significantly, that's one of the first things he starts to lay out about this scene, and it's another reflection of the materialism of this culture, where you judge things based on what you can see. The priest began with a brief outline of sacred history, which is a very flat description of what he says. A brief outline of sacred history. Sacred history has no brief outline. I'm sorry. The most terse outline you can find is going to run pages and pages and pages and pages. But that's sort of funny. Listening to him, Felicity saw in imagination the Garden of Eden, the flood, the Tower of Babel, cities burning, people dying, and idols being overthrown, and this dazzling vision left her with a great respect for the Almighty and profound fear of his wrath. So she is sitting there. We are not told in any detail what the priest is saying, but she listens, and we get a portrayal of what she is getting out of it. And so we're at a little bit of a remove there. But the focus is not on the religious stuff. It's not on the Garden of Eden, the flood, the Tower of Babel, cities burning, people dying. It's not on any of that. It's on her taking all that in. She's probably never really heard these stories before, and she herself is being swept up because we are not hearing any of them before. We're just being told these little tags, these little organizational story titles, if you will, of the flood, the Garden of Eden, all these things that we all sort of know, but we're not given any dramatization of it. We're not brought into that world too much. It's just sort of name-checking stuff that for us is going to be much more automatic. For her, it's very personal. But here we are objectified from her because she is reacting to this stuff to which we, we're not. We're just hearing loose titles that are being name dropped, and she is getting transported, and we can see her getting swept away by all of this as we stay stationary as readers, because her devotion to this religious moment, this spiritual moment, is something for us to consider, something for us to objectify, something for us to judge her on, for good or for ill, and not get swept up ourselves. And this is really the entire project of Gustave Flaubert. Understanding, or at least recording the reactions, the actions and reactions of human beings in different settings and to different stimuli. And here she is utterly transposed. Then she wept as she listened to the story of the Passion. Why had they crucified him when he loved children, fed the multitudes, healed the blind, and had chosen out of humility to be born of the poor on the litter of a stable? So now we're getting more specific here, and we can't help but wonder, okay, yeah, that is a silly thing. When you put it that way, why would they? Let's objectify the story of Christ. Let's study and consider the story of Christ. Does it make sense? That's a revolution in its own way. She found it difficult, however, to imagine that what the Holy Ghost looked like, for it was not just a bird, but a fire as well, and sometimes a breath. And here she's going into, as the footnotes tell you, that these are conventional, metaphors for the Holy Spirit. But significantly, she wants to know what it looked like. She has a somewhat one-dimensional or two-dimensional mentality, and she has difficulty conceiving of anything outside that. So something that is truly ideal is a stretch for her. She's feeling the emotionalism of it. She's feeling the sentiment, and you get the sense that she's really reaching something outside herself, which in itself is an extraordinary capacity for somebody who's just supposed to be so limited. Just an ignorant little maid isn't supposed to have these elevated sentiments. But she cannot really grasp the mystery of it. She has no understanding of the intangible, of the immaterial. Maybe that makes her smarter than most people. Maybe that's just a sign of, well, those people have no capacity for the true depth of Christianity. They're where they are for a reason. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's many other things. But the point is, we are not being told which way. We're just sitting there watching as he charts all this down, data point by data point, and we are invited to speculate as to how we're going to interpret it. The reactions of the reaction she has are something for us to consider, but not necessarily something that we're supposed to feel a lot of empathy for, or not something that we're supposed to share. It is a way of singling her out as she puzzles through this. The of dogma, she neither understood nor even tried to understand anything, which is kind of a cold line. And especially after all of this, that we're told that she is, she's grappling for something, she's struggling with it, but this curt, dismissive sentence just shoots all that down. It showed her for a moment sort of reaching up towards something, and then the narration steps outside and looks at her and brings its own it's another conflicting data point on that. You could say that that is the narrator stepping outside and being judgmental, but this isn't necessarily a point of opinion. This is, she neither understood nor even tried to understand anything. You don't know what she's trying. Maybe she is. She seems to be questioning, but still, it has that patina of an objective statement, even if it seems objectively slanted against her. Remember, this is a largely bourgeois audience who would be reading this, so that would be kind of baked into the cake, that prejudice. So maybe Flaubert is hinting it that way. Maybe he's showing his own prejudice. Maybe he is trying to tease it out of somebody else to get them to sort of step in and lurch in with that, and then start to, once you have them hooked that way, you can start to expose other things. I'm not sure, but it's fun to consider. Throughout this scene, what really captures her is is a kind of she becomes fascinated with communion, with the sharing of the body and blood of Christ, the cracker and the juice or the wine. And this is, in Catholic terms, transubstantiation, where the wine and the cracker become the body and blood, or are, simultaneously are. There's a lot of subtlety there that I'm not even going to try and penetrate. But what's significant is she gets enthusiastic for that, for not the actual, but the symbol. The representation is what carries her along. And she seems to like having that vessel to latch onto and move her through an experience. The ceremony is deeply, deeply moving for her as she watches Virginia and the other children go through it. She goes back afterwards by herself, and the experience leaves her flat. She needs, for some reason, to have that intermediary, that symbol, that representation, in order to access that experience. And this, I think, gets at something very fundamental. A representation is a kind of copy. And it strikes me that throughout this story, it dwells on the nature of copying. She is moved by watching somebody else go through the experience. She is moved by the transubstantiation. The parallel experience is an important factor here. Madame Aubain and Felicity are both women who have suffered loss in their lives, and they are trying to, find their way in the world. What is the difference between one or the other? Something seemingly artificial like class, like the amount of money you have in the world. They are mirror images of one another. They are copies of one another, just transposed into a slightly different context. And how legitimate is that transposition? I would say that this story is asking that repeatedly. The story itself is laid out in that episodic, repetitive notion where she has a relationship with someone, her parents, her first love, the children who Virginia dies, the Paul, the boy, essentially just goes off and, abandons her and has another life. She has a nephew who comes into her life, exploits her. She loves him, she dotes on him, he takes everything he can from her, and he abandons her, and he goes off and dies. Again and again and again, people come into her life, leave, die. She suffers loss and loss and loss and loss and loss. And each episode can be seen in its structure as a copy of the one before it, or the first one. It's all the same thing. Each episode is a copy of the other. There is no real difference between them. So that's one aspect of copies. Another is the last episode, where she is given a parrot. Another family with whom they have become friends has to leave suddenly, and they give her a parrot. And she likes the parrot because it reminds her of, in other words, is a sort of copy of her nephew, because her nephew died as a sailor sailing off to America, and she's told that the parrot is from America. Probably the Caribbean, but America, North America. So she feels that sentiment, she feels that connection through it being a copy of her nephew. And she develops a great fondness for this, even as the parrot is used as a kind of copy of her. The parrot is scolded, essentially, or disliked intensely by Madame Aubin's friends because it is messy. It is, let me think, where is it? Page 671. Unfortunately, he had a tiresome mania for biting his perch, and also used to pull his feathers out, scatter his droppings everywhere, and upset his bathwater. Which is exactly what birds do. If anybody who's had a parrot, a parakeet, a macaw, anything like that, that's what they do. That and the screeching is pretty much their entire life's existence. If you have a domestic bird, this is what they do. And they are all scoffing at this and saying, oh, why does it have to do all that? Well, it is limited by its natural identity. This is what birds do. This is what Felicity has essentially been coming up against all the time. She's being blamed and limited because of the characteristics of her identity as a member of her class. She cannot necessarily escape them. She cannot simply, she cannot suddenly come into the world, or you just adopt an education and a bank account and be, and be one of the hoi polloi. She has limitations within what she can do, and should she really be blamed for that? The bird is then a copy of Felicity. The bird also significantly acts as an agent of copying, because what do parrots do? Well, they repeat. If you say something in front of them, we repeat. We're told that, one of the famous lines in here is that he learns to parrot the squawking of Madame Aubin, who says, "Felicity, the door, or whatever it is. And the bird starts copying that, repeating that, imitating that, and imitation, copying. Finally, of course, the sequence copies again, and the bird dies. Felicity loses her bird. Has to happen. One more imitation comes around, however, in that Felicity gets the bird stuffed. So now she takes it to a taxidermist, comes back after a long period of time. She doesn't have a lot of money, and people are kind of ignoring her. They don't really take her very seriously. She finally gets it done, and she gets this bird back. So now that is a dead copy of the live bird, and she loves the copy just as much. And then at the end, the bird is with her as she dies. She is alone. Madame Aubin has died before that. Paul and his new wife have settled down into a life of respectability in bourgeois values after a somewhat dissolute life. When he was growing up and his mom kept paying his bills for him. It's nice to have a safety net, which Felicity never had. But Felicity is on her deathbed, and she is, slipping in and out of consciousness. She has nothing. The only thing she really has is a few little items that she was allowed to keep from Madame Aubin's house after Paul and his wife, just decide, well, we don't need, this is just the junk. You want to take it. But she takes it very, she treasures everything about that stuff. Everything that reminds her, that is a souvenir of, a copy of, a representation of, an imitation of the life she had with the family when Virginia was alive, when Madame Aubin was there, and she had a identity, a shared identity. So much so that famously the mother, Madame Aubin and Felicity, in grieving for Virginia at one point are said to be, they found a kind of equal basis. They embrace one another. They find that kind of bond and are suddenly on the same level with one another, which is a shocking term. But on her deathbed, the bird is there. She had lost it for a little while, of course, but it's come back to her. It is even more decrepit now because maggots have gotten to it and the stuffing is coming out, and it really probably looks disgusting. But she still she venerates it. She sets up a shrine with it, and she blurs the line between it becomes part of her religious observance. It becomes a icon of God, an idol of God. So she venerates it, she worships it, she loves it, and in her final moments, she looks up, and what does she see? In place of, in a moment of her apotheosis, essentially, where she is supposed to be raising up in a kind of parallel copy of the religious spiritual experience that she had with Virginia early on, where she is spiritually uplifted. Here she is alone, except for a neighbor woman who's sort of taking care of her, but even she cannot get out of her own mind. Says, well, yeah, I'm going to be in the same place as somebody else, as this woman right now, so I got to do this. She's not doing it out of any real sense of generosity, but rather as a sense of, well, all right, I got to do it, and this makes me think of myself. Felicity looks up as she thinks she sees the the angel of death coming to bring her up to heaven, and it looks like a parrot. Parrot is a representation of the angels above. It is at once a kind of reminder of the earthly nature, perhaps, of spirituality, where heaven is what we see around us at all times. Maybe it is perhaps a deliberate parody or travesty of the religious experience, that this preposterous, worm-eaten, long dead bird is suddenly a representation, or taken by her simple mind, simple heart, to be a representation of the grandeur of God. That seems not unlikely. The complications involved in this interpretation are just so subtle, and all Flaubert is doing is writing it down. He is a master at writing. He is a master at simply laying out what he sees in ways that you probably don't even notice. Just the simple laying out of sentence after sentence, you sometimes don't even think about what he's not saying. One of the things that always strikes me, quite frankly, is his use of pronouns. A pronoun, which is a copy of a noun, it's a substitute for, it's an imitation of the noun. Very frequently, he'll have, like, the first half of a sentence, he will mention Felicity and Madame Aubin, and in the second half of the sentence, he just has a simple singular pronoun, she. And the first couple of times I went there, it's like, ah, man, this is annoying. You know, which one does he mean? Now, French can be very deliberate about its use of pronouns, so I'm not going to say that, you know, this is perfect. This is a perfect thought that I'm trying to enunciate here. And translators always have problems with that. But the slippery use of pronouns, I would say, is another way of blurring identity just a little bit. Because if the she refers to, or could refer to, both Madame Aubin and Felicity, well, what's the difference between them? Who should it reference? Well, it should always reference the higher ranking woman. What's the point of that? What's the significance of that? Should you be drawn into that consideration? Should you be questioning that assumption? All of these thoughts come up with just the use of a pronoun, which again is just an imitation, a copy of the original. Style. It's what he works with. The mechanisms of the plot, you know, he borrows an awful lot of that throughout his career, fairly conventional plots, but the way he ties it together is always with style, with the word choice, with the little contradictions that he sets up, with the balancing of the plot points against one another. When a certain arrangement might suggest itself and he changes the order of that arrangement of plot points, this is curious. Well, why? Well, through style, he can lay out his objective, which is to objectify the world around him. He is inviting readers to draw their own conclusions about their world. And in so doing, he's rigorously stripping away all the illusions that we live with every day, that we use to sort of construct our world and our assumptions about the world, that we use just habitually. And these are essentially our prejudices, our ways of thinking, our ways of interpreting the world, our ways of understanding, well, what is the right thing to do, our morality. Strip that away, and you're left with just the actions. just the behavior. And Flaubert is cataloging that behavior. Data point by data point by data point. In so doing, he is creating the model for the modern novel. He is laying out what literature is supposed to do in the broad sense of literature, but also in the new realist sense, that romanticism is past. We're not going to sit there and bring our prejudices to everything. We're not going to start, venerating certain ideals that have nothing to do with the way things are. And we're going to shift our focus to studying the way things are, because that has value too. You can't always just remind everybody how things could be. That gets hollow after a while. You need to look a cold, clear-eyed look at the way things are. And that's what Flaubert offers.